I'd like to welcome everyone to the 50th anniversary of Apollo 13 panel. I was extremely excited when Mr. Abbey said that we were going to be doing this panel. Even though that it's 50 years ago, it's a compelling story. And I think there's a lot of lessons, both in the way controllers operate, hardware, and how hardware can be used in novel ways that can have an impact on Artemis and other exploration programs. Of course, after 50 years, there's been a lot said, movies made. I like some of the quotes. John Aaron, who was a controller, I think he was involved mostly with energy management, but he said Apollo 13 was the final proof of what flight controllers could do. No doubt that's true. This was really a big flight controller story. But there's another quote that says it was the finest example of teamwork in NASA's history. And this is, I think, is really true. And it says that even the backup astronauts who weren't assigned came in, the contractors who were involved with hardware for the lunar module and the command service modules, the doctors that were involved. So many people came together to make this transition from a lunar landing to a survival of the crew happen. As you know, the issue started before the flight when Charlie Duke got German measles or rubella, and one of the crew members that was exposed, TK Mattingly, was not immune to that. NASA would normally have swapped out an entire crew because they don't want to break up crews. But since Duke was sick and one of the people on the mission was not immune, they did the switch out with Jack Swigert with TK Mattingly. One of the other things that kind of gets lost in all of the explosion and that sort of thing is that Milt Windler was on his initial lead flight director during ascent. And they actually had an anomaly on ascent where the center engine on the second stage got into an oscillation problem and was shut down by the vehicle. Luckily, that didn't expand to a bigger problem, and the other engines just ran longer and got them to the right altitude and the right velocity to continue the mission. When Apollo 13 was going on, 11 had been successful, 12 had been successful, and the interest had died down quite a bit. In fact, 30 minutes before the unintended disassembly of this oxygen tank, they had a downlink for TV, and not a single network covered that downlink. Really, it's underestimated the risk of what was going on. And then, of course, around 205,000 miles from the Earth, heading the wrong direction for survival, Jack Swigert came up with the chilling words, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here," which really started things happening. I'm so happy that this panel has flight directors, it has crew, it has controllers, it has the Capcoms, it has physicians who are involved in this. I think it's going to be a fantastic panel. Moderating the panel is Jerry Griffin. Jerry had a great career after Apollo. Of course, he became Deputy Center Director at Kennedy. He was at Dryden, he was at headquarters. He followed Chris Kraft as the Center Director at JSC. He was in movies, he got honorary degrees. I'm not going to talk about those things. I want to talk about his career up to Apollo 13 because I think his path is fairly similar to quite a few of the other people that were in the front room and the back room supporting this mission. He graduated in aeronautical engineering from Texas A&M University. Texas A&M is one of the supporters of the ISMS, and we really thank them for that. He went to the Air Force and got into fighter airplanes as a weapons system officer, also in navigation, and spent several years in the Air Force. Then after the Air Force, he went into the space industry, working with Lockheed and Sunnyvale, working with the Genas and satellite launches and that sort of thing, and then later in Texas at General Dynamics. He went to NASA in 1964 and worked on Gemini. Of course, Gemini had a Genas, which was a good deal for him. He worked Gemini 2 through 12 in guidance, navigation, and control. He also became involved in the leadership of the branch that covered the command service modules. And that was really good because the first two missions, Apollo 7 and Apollo 8, were command service module missions because the lunar lander wasn't quite ready yet at that time. In 1968, he became a flight director and was called his team the Gold Team, which he used throughout the rest of his flight director career. He worked all 9 of the Apollo missions that went to the moon. He was the lead flight director for the landing on 3 of those missions. And he also was lead flight controller on 3. And so as part of that, he worked Apollo 12, where around, I don't know, 50 seconds or so into the launch, they had the lightning strikes, lost a lot of data downlink, had a lot of problems. But he sat there in the console and saw that the Saturn was doing fine and was able to get his crew to come up with some magic commands to reconstitute the downlinks from the command service module, and that mission went on and had a successful landing on the moon. On Apollo 13, he was supposed to work the landing. In fact, he says he turned over a great spacecraft to Gene Kranz when he left Mission Control that night, and he went out and played softball, is my understanding. And after the problem with the tank occurred, he came to Mission Control, probably the only time in his career, in his sweatsuits from playing softball. He was able to find out that there wasn't going to be a landing. His goal team was going to have to be working in survival mode, so he went home at that time and went to sleep to come back in and do his part of the rest of the mission. There are a lot of critical issues that were worked. Power and water, since there were no fuel cells, or they'd been damaged, was a major issue. There was issues with oxygen, CO2, as you know.
I can't.
Issues with trajectory and how to keep as many options open as possible, trying to get back as soon as possible, and using systems in a novel way. Of course, the time that they took getting back was critical also, because it took a while to come up with the power-up procedures for the command module to successfully do the landing. This is a fantastic story. The right people are here today to do this, and I'm going to turn it over to Jerry Griffin to lead the panel.
Well, thank you, Richard. Any questions? That was a good rundown. We got a great team. I told them that in the interest of time, they were going to have the shortest introductions they ever had in their career. We've got, as you said, a lot of the right kind of people to talk about this mission. Before I start that, though, I wanted to say that when George Abbey called me about this panel, he said, you know, rather than just go through the timeline, which we've heard a lot, we've done, all of us have done quite a lot of the timeline of the mission, but is to really step back a little bit and see what it was that we did that was kind of stretching the systems well beyond their limit, or at least what they were qualified to do. And also, is there any message in these lessons learned that we got out of Apollo 13 that we could tend to want to pass to the Artemis people and those that are going to try to go back to the moon, just to think about? And when I first heard that, I thought it might be a little of a daunting task, but actually, the more I've thought about it, I've talked to some of you, I think there are good examples where we learned something on Apollo 13 that is still as valid as it ever was. And so I hope we can get into that. We got two great doctors here today on the panel that, and I know there's a lot in the audience that are very familiar with Apollo and Apollo 13 specifically. Bill Carpentier is a veteran of many space flights, spent a lot of time on aircraft carriers and airplanes and helicopters and all kinds of things. So happened on Apollo 13, he was in Building 30, the Mission Control Center, in one of the back rooms, and Bill told me that he was already getting ready, had been assigned to Apollo 14. So Bill, welcome aboard. We've also got Mike Berry. He's got a special connection to Apollo. Most of us knew his dad extremely well, Chuck, and Mike grew up in the business, and he has heard his dad say, I guess, tell every story he could ever tell, and so he says he can channel, and I agree. He's a great Aeromed guy in his own right. He spent 6 years, as a matter of fact, at Johnson Space Center as the chief of the Aerospace Medicine Office. He also went into private practice with his dad in the aerospace business or aeromed business. And then he wound up a career just recently. In fact, I think he's just moved back to Texas with the FAA, where he was the FAA head surgeon. I've forgotten, I'm blanking on the title, but anyway, federal surgeon, federal air surgeon. So anyhow, we got him. We got the 2 Capcoms out of 3 that's worked on the mission. And they were under the line of fire. The Capcoms were in the middle between us and the crew on the ground. They had to interpret not only what the crew was saying, but what we were saying and what the flight director was actually finally making the final decisions to pass up to the crew. So it was an extremely busy time. Vance Brand was the 3rd. He's not with us today, but we've got Joe Kerwin, we've got Jack Lausma, and we're going to hear quite a bit from them. On the command module, we've got Bill Moon, systems guy. He was an ECOM support at this point. And Bill was in the middle of trying to figure out with the rest of the people what had happened, A, and then B, what to do about it. So Bill is with us today, and we've also got Bill Reeves on the lunar module side, counterparts that worked both of those. So it was a united effort here. Thank goodness we were still docked when this whole thing happened, and so that was our savior. We'll probably get into that. And then we got Bill Stovall, who was a flight dynamics officer. And of course, the FIDO, as we called him, was the person that had to calculate all the maneuvers, figure out when to perform them, and also to make sure that we stayed on the right path to get home, which was a little touchy on this mission. And but we've got Bill with us, and good to see him again. I haven't seen you in a long time, Bill. And then finally, of course, we got a guy named Fred Hayes, who just happened to be in the spacecraft when all this chaos started. And Fred, I know you're probably tired of talking about Apollo 13, but you've one time told me you never get really tired of telling the story. So it's great to have you, because your perspective is going to be extremely important. I want to pick up on something to get this started. And Fred, I really would like to get your take on this. When I went back and looked at the Apollo 13 mission report, and when I did, I got down to the very end. It talked about conclusions. And one of the first conclusions they reached, that this kind, let me just read it. The concept of a backup crew was proven for the first time when 3 days prior, one of the prime crewmen got exposed to the measles. I think that backup crew and the way we did it turned out to be very effective. Could you just comment on that and how easy it was for Jack to slip in place of Ken Mattingly?
Well, I was on board 13. I served as a backup crew on Apollo 8 to Bill Anders, and I was a backup to Buzz Aldrin on 11. And we basically trained in step. We split simulators. One would have morning, one would have afternoon, etc. We all went on the same geology field trips. So you basically mirrored exactly what the prime crew did for the most part. And so, as far as technically and from a standpoint of performing, call it the basics of the mission, you were qualified to go. And I certainly felt that way for Bill Anders or for Buzz, for that matter. On 11, I could have flown the mission. Probably the only thing Jack was a little behind on was the photo plan. Ken Mattingly was prime crew, and Ken is a very tedious guy, very disciplined, details, and he was messing with the photo plan with Farouk Abbas to the 11th hour. So I'm sure the red lines that he'd worked in the photo plan for lunar orbit stuff, probably Jack wasn't quite up to. But as far as the basic, call it the important things to handle in the dynamic phases, certainly Jack was very capable. And I was a little sorry to see how that was played in the movie, Apollo 13. It kind of gave, I think, a flavor of that Jack wasn't ready to go, wasn't qualified, et cetera. Now, we did train with Jack until I think about 8 o'clock the night before launch. We were in the simulators, and we basically went through the dynamic phases to make sure we were talking to each other in the same way among the prime crew as the backup crew, where we had to have crew coordination. And we did a rendezvous, I remember, and Jim, I think, even inserted some out of plane and had Jack do a rescue. It was a little added test, but that was about it. So I think Jack was fully qualified, as I think any backup that trained for the missions was qualified to go fly the mission.
Okay, and so I think that is a good point. The backup crews are extremely important, and going back to the moon is going to be equally important. That the backup crews are fit right into the training schedule and make it happen. Good. I want to turn to the Capcoms now and talk with Jack and Joe. Jack was on duty when the tank exploded. And so he was really faced the brunt of the first piece, trying to interpret what the crew had described and then what we were seeing in mission control. Jack, you want to talk about that a little bit? You don't have to go through the whole timeline, but kind of describe that period of what it was like.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. I came on board as one of the new guys, the original 19, and our people were starting to fly mid-Apollo time. But before that, of course, we would assist the crews by being on support crews. So there were 3 support crewmen for every mission. And I did Apollo 9 and 10 and 13. And my major role on the support crew for Apollos 9 and 10 was to get the lunar module through test and checkout at the Cape. I would represent the flight crew, make sure everything was done well, and that we got the changes made that had to be made in the lunar module. So by the time I got to Apollo 13, I'd already had about 750 hours of lunar module cockpit time, either in the lunar module test and checkout or in the simulator. So, frankly, I don't know how I was assigned at that particular time. There were 4 flight control teams, and there were only 3 Capcoms, and we didn't go with one of the teams. We just were assigned to a certain time. And maybe Fred can tell you better than I why I was on duty at that particular time, but it turned out to be fortuitous, I guess, because this is a major time in the lunar module's life. And so I got there mid-afternoon, well before we were going to do before the explosion and before the free return mission or firing of the engines. And it was a rather relaxed afternoon. And then early in the evening, the crew was going to give an expose of the lunar module to the general public. And this was all warm and comfortable. So they took the television cameras inside the lunar module and showed us around. Meanwhile, back in the in the viewing room behind the control center, the wives were there with the kids and uncles and grandfathers and brothers and sisters and so forth to watch this viewing of the lunar module, which is also broadcast on the major networks. And the crew showed us everything, and it was very comfortable and very well done. It was an extensive tour, and Jim and Fredo, of course, were prime in showing us all the things in there. And so it was finally concluded, and the crew said, we're going to take a little nap right now. And so we're going to conclude this television program. Television cameras in that time, of course, were about the size of a suitcase. So they weren't quite as nifty as they are now. So it was a major operation. And so the crew went back into the command module, and the folks in the viewing room went home. Well, I think Marilyn Lovell had been home for about 10 minutes, and she lived nearby. And her whole world was turned upside down, because we went from a very neat and warm, fuzzy kind of a feeling to one of absolute total possible disaster and unknowns, because the explosion had occurred shortly after she returned home, and it came on the news. And then, of course, some of our astronaut buddies started showing up, and her friends were there to be with her and the family. But what I wanted to point out was that this was a total change from perfect to impossible for the flight crew's families. And of course, we went to work in the control center, and Gene Kranz, the white team, was on duty, and Gene, of course, was the flight director. And so the explosion occurred, and radio down to Houston, we have a problem. And I had been talking with Gene about something, and I didn't get all the conversation, so I said, "Say again, please." And Jim came up and said, "We've had a problem," and that put everybody's nose into their scopes and looking at the readings back from the service module, the command and service module, and noticed that things were deteriorating very rapidly. Nobody knew exactly what happened, and so the flight control team got busy and worked on that. And meanwhile, I would transmit information that the control team and flight director wanted me to send to the crew, and I would.
Right from where we're going, or right from the way we should have done?
Say again, please.
Mike, you got a video up, Mike. I don't know. Go ahead, Jack. We'll wind this one up.
So I guess the point was that everything went from feeling warm and fuzzy before this explosion occurred. Of course, the pre-return burn had already been done before that, so the crew was committed to go into orbit about the moon, and we were headed for altitude of about the moon, about 60 miles, but we were still a long ways out, maybe half a day. And so I guess I can let Fred take it from there, or yourself.
Well, let me stop there, because I think there's a message in here that portends for the future. When you mentioned it, Jack, when we had 4 flight control teams, and we only had 3 Capcoms, which was okay, which was fine. They could kind of go through our shifts without any change. But I think it's the message, or the lesson learned here, was that we had excess capability even on the ground in the flight control piece. And let me tell you why I think that. We took the white team, Kranz's team, and took them completely offline for a while, and let them work on trying to figure out what had happened and what they did in the early stage of the shutdown of the lunar module. It left 3 teams then in the control center: Glenn Lundy's black team, Milt Wendler's maroon team, and my gold team, and we just pressed on. The white team being offline was just a little bit of the other people that were offline that were working hard on this. We had of course, the backup crew, Young and Duke, were running all kinds of sims. Every time we came up with an idea, we had them run it. We had TK Mattingly heavily involved with the power guys, trying to figure out mainly how to get the command module powered back up after it had been shut down. So my point here is, the lesson learned is that we had plenty of excess capacity The only place we were a little short of the excess capacity was on board the spacecraft. But on the ground, we had plenty of robust backup system and way to go to keep the flight running and also do these offline functions. And that doesn't even include what was going on at the contractors and all of that. So to me, that was it was serendipity, I think, a bit that we had 4 teams, and we stayed that way most of the rest of the way. And then finally toward the end, we went back to 3 teams of Apollo. But anyhow, I thought there was a good message there. And Joe got involved later, really big time, on reading up the power up checklist in the command module, which, by the way, I think everybody probably knows the command module had never been completely shut down. We had to save it for entry. It had never been completely shut down in space ever. And so we had to figure out a way at the Cape, when you had things there, you had ground support equipment and all kinds of things to help you get it going, and plumbing and electricity and all kinds of inputs. But in space, all we had was some small batteries in the command module and some larger ones in the lunar module. And we had to figure out how to get that. If we have time, we're going to get into more detail of that. Joe, I'm going to come back to you on the checklist because I wanted to talk with Bill Stovall and get him to set the stage. We're about 200,000 miles from home. We're about 40,000 miles from Earth when this thing happened. And Bill, why did we have to get back on a free return? Free return means we could just sling around the moon and come home. But we had started that way, and then we got off of it. And Bill, talk about the trajectory aspects up there in the early going, getting back on the free return, and then figuring out what to do after we went around the moon.
Griff, as I remember the story, I think Apollo 13 was the first flight that we physically went on to a non-free return trajectory. And that had to do with where the landing site was, and et cetera, et cetera. But the problem with the non-free return trajectory is that if something happens, you ain't coming home. So as soon as the explosion occurred and we got to realize what was going on, the immediate discussion centered around either doing a direct abort, which would have taken you right back to Earth, but was really pretty dicey, or waiting a little while, seeing what you had. And if we were going to abort the mission and come back home, then we needed to get onto a free return trajectory in case everything else died, okay? So once the decision was made to go to free return, the lunar mission was lost, but the crew had a reasonable chance, given our state vector knowledge, that they could have possibly made it back home and possibly re-entered. In all likelihood, that wasn't true, and it turned out not to be because we needed to do mid-course corrections coming home. But that was the immediate decisions that were made, and those were made by Glenn's team, because we had just handed over the white team to the black team, and the black team actually executed that maneuver. Once we were on the free return, now we had other options. One of which was to speed up the trip home by approximately a day by using the descent engine again after we went past the moon, or we could have just rode it out for 4 days and hope we had enough oxygen, power, et cetera, which we didn't. So the next big decision was to do a PC+2 maneuver right after we came around the moon to bring us home a day early. And that was obviously what saved their lives. Without that day, they would never have made it. We did a couple other small mid-course corrections coming home, but the trajectory part of it was pretty straightforward. Once we made the decisions, the mid-course corrections, no decision really was necessary. You got to do them or you're not going to re-enter. So it was pretty straightforward coming home. I remember we did mid-course 5 there, flight.
That's right, we did. Okay, turning to the systems guys then. Now let's pick up on this because, and I think, again here, I think it showed that we had the capability to get through these very unnormal, very abnormal situations. And I've always thought that one of the great strengths of Apollo was the simulation capability. When I think back over 50 years ago now at the fidelity of the simulations that we had, given the technology we were working with, it was pretty amazing. We had inside the control center, I know when we had some simulation guys could just drive us to our knees, but that's what we wanted. We wanted to be tested. We wanted to just almost buckle. So I really think at the end of the day, our simulation capability helped. And I'd like to get Bill Reeves. Bill sent me a note that one of the things that happened in this, all in this same time frame, was that we happened to be in a shift handover. And you mentioned it, Bill. It reminded me of it, between the white team and the black team. And Bill, you said you thought that was a positive. Talk about that a little.
Yeah, that was very fortuitous, because we had a lot of resources in the control center at that time. And we were in the middle of a shift handover when the accident happened. And it was really kind of interesting because right after it happened, the biggest problem was crowd control. I was always impressed by the management and the flight directors and the management of the organizations and how everybody stepped in and got everything organized in a very short period of time, because people from all over were calling in and coming in and everybody wanted to help. And so it was chaotic there for a few minutes until things got sorted out and everybody got assigned specific jobs to go do and get everything under control.
Yeah, it was, when I walked back in, the only thing I noticed was the number of people in the control center. They had come and they got Findell and me to come, Ed Findell, to come back in, and we had been playing softball, and the number of people in there was just incredible. But it was very orderly and quiet. It wasn't undisciplined. It was just more people involved. Now, is there any message in there? I think it says be ready. Again, and the simulations that we went through, I think, got us there. Bill Moon, you were involved, of course, from the ecom perspective, that it was your tank that blew up, and you were trying to figure out what to do. What was and I know you weren't in the front room at the time, but what was that power situation? I know you thought for a long time, the team thought it might be an instrumentation issue. Just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I've gone back and looked at the transcript and listened to some of the transcript and even talked to Cy Liebergott. I think the first indication that he had was, this was an instrumentation, and it looked like a big thing that the sim guys were trying to get to him, because we never thought we could lose the total power system this way. But it took him quite a while to get convinced that it was not an instrumentation problem. And, Bill said it was good that we had this other team come in at the handover. And that's where he could get some more brain power behind him to talk to his back room, the two back rooms, from the different teams talking together to say, hey guys, this is real. Let's get this thing squared away. And here's some of the things we need to do. Calm down. Let's work some procedures out. Let's see if we can isolate the leak. And if not, what do we do next? Similar to, let's get all the energy we can out of this fuel cell to charge the batteries. Because we had used some of the batteries up during launch, and we were about 20 to 30 amp hours short. So the first thing we did was try to charge that battery back up to get us all the energy we could. And try to isolate it, because all we had left, if we lost all the oxygen tanks, we had a surge tank that had 3.7 pounds of oxygen. And then we had 1 pound packs for each of the crewmen for the face mask on the way up. So we had a total of 6 pounds of oxygen in the command module. But we were fortuitous.
All gaseous. All
Right,
gaseous.
all gaseous, not cryogenic. Right. The big supply was where we had lost that because of the explosion. But I think this was a good time, and it was just at the right time. I think, like Bill said, we had extra brain power in the control center to convince each other that it was not an instrumentation problem. Because if you looked at all the data, if I'd have been out there, I'd been confused at first 30 minutes or so. Trying to get all this information, even though the crew was saying, hey, I got all these main bus caution and warning lights, and all my voltage are going to hell in a handbasket, and just a time to gather everybody together and get under control and
Okay, well,
plot a path.
let's fast forward a little bit. We finally got the command module shut down. And we were going to live in the LEM, 3 guys living in a vehicle that was only designed for 2. We did have the tunnel available for space, but both the command module and the tunnel got older than heck, and they ended up mostly in the Leonard module. Eventually, we were going to have to power up the CSM in order to re-enter, or the command module for sure. And so I really think the team worked that hard. They kept changing it because of the SIMs and everything else. And Lovell got extremely agitated about get the checklist up to it we needed. Well, finally, we got a checklist to how to start from scratch and power that thing up. And that duty to read that up fell to Joe Kerwin and some to Vance Brand. And it was literally, this is 50-year ago technology. We had no way to uplink that. We had to read it. And it had to be written down on paper by Jack Swigert. And one of the problems he had is he was running out of paper. He didn't have enough to write on. Joe, talk through that. You guys did I thought, a super job of getting that up, and without a mistake. And they got it powered up. So Joe, speak. You're muted. You got your mute on, Joe.
Gotta turn it off again. There we go. I thought Vance was the one who did the super job of reading it up. Jack, did you play any role in that? Jack?
Oh, I had other duties coming home. I guess I
neither.
I had my
was not
story at the beginning.
at that time. I was on to hear Jim Lovell time and again say, we've got to have it up. We've got to have it up. We've got to understand it. We've got to read it. We got to check the switch positions. And we have 3 hours of battery power to do this whole thing. And of course, they were more tired and more cold. And Fred, you may not have been cold, but you probably had a fever by that time. But there was never a word about that. It was just, let's get on with it. Let's get on with it. The only part I played reading up was to read up to Jack Swigert, the checklist for putting together that kludge with which we were able to use command module carbon dioxide remover cartridges in the LEM. The command modules ones were rectangular and the LEM ones were round, and the crew would have died of an overdose of carbon dioxide if Ed Smiley and his team hadn't come up with a quick, simple, effective way to get that done and bring it in and show me how to do it so that I could read it up to Jack.
Yeah, I was on duty with you when you read that PCO2 fix up, and it was, that's another one where I thought it would probably look entirely different than what we had done on the ground. And when we got photos of what they had done, it looked exactly like the one we had done on the ground.
Perfect
job. So, yeah, that's right. You did read that up, and I guess Vance did read most of that Power Up to CSM.
I think
It was long and it was very, very detailed, one circuit breaker at a time in many cases, and switches. The Artemis crews will have that better because they will have an uplink capability and ways to get information, a lot of information up at once that we didn't have. But again, I think it shows when you get the crew and the ground in sync with each other, they can do just about anything. Well, that PCO2 problem, partial pressure CO2 problem, is a good segue to the doctors to wade in here. We had that problem that we had to get fixed, and we had a shortage of water that led to some pretty serious dehydration, I think. And then I got to bring Fred into this because he kept stealing water out of the command module as long as he could. And so let's start with Bill, and but Mike, you jump in too as required. Were there any really serious crew concerns you had that you were able to do anything about in real time? And I've always thought about that. Was there something we could have prescribed or done differently? Now, of course, I know they were taking meds, and that's all in the mission report. They were taking, I think, things for headaches and all that. But could you guys talk about that a little bit and see, was there anything, Bill, why don't you start it, Carpentier?
Well, the immediate concerns were oxygen supply, water supply, and removal of carbon dioxide, as well as temperature control. And that depended mainly on the flight controllers and the engineers to be able to come up with a solution to that. So we had to follow that as closely as we could. And I was asked, what levels were we looking for? Well, the command module and the lunar module, the environmental control system was designed for an optimal level of 3.8 millimeters of mercury carbon dioxide or less, because that was considered an okay level. It could go up to 7.6 millimeters of mercury before you got concerned. But once it got to 15 millimeters of mercury, that became an emergency level because symptoms would start to come in, at least in some people, at about that level. And as levels got above 15 millimeters of mercury, increased pulse rates would happen, increased respirations, and some decreased threshold of hearing loss. And then as it got higher and higher, other symptoms would occur. Is increased respiration rate and headaches and nausea. And this could progress once it got up to around 40 millimeters of mercury, and then could progress to mental depression and decreased visual discrimination. And then as it decreased responsiveness, and then unconsciousness. So that's, any kind of symptoms would be looking for would be important. And then, the oxygen supply, was absolutely vital because we can't live without oxygen. But that became the main concerns. But then the water supply, as the flight got on, because they were having to ration the water, and that's not a good thing.
Hey, Jerry, this is Mike. Just to add to what Bill said, particularly regarding the CO2, and the 15 as one of the areas that you sort of drew a line in the sand, so to speak, and that's certainly of concern. And yet, in reality, what they did, and this is not me, this would have been my dad and Bill and the other medical people, that they knew from chamber studies that they could actually go up to 22 millimeters of mercury and the crew would do okay. So yes, 15 was what everybody planned on as a line in the sand, but they knew physiologically that this crew could do okay based upon studies to all the way up to 22. And Jerry, you mentioned the medications. The medications, there was some, and you've talked about Capcoms and getting data up to the crew and transmitting what was wanted from the medical people. There were times when, from a fatigue point of view, medicine wanted the crew to take some dexedrine in order to be fully alert for doing the parts of the burn that was needed for reentry. Deke Slayton agreed, and everybody agreed that, yeah, that's what needed to be done. And I don't know whether it was Joe or whether it was Jack, whoever transmitted that, yes, they wanted to take dexedrine, but nobody told them how to do it or when to do it. And in reality, it never got utilized. And the same thing happened, I think, from a transmitting data from the Capcoms up to the crew was related to sleep medication. Jack Lausma had actually taken, Jim Lovell had actually taken the Seconal on his prior mission for sleep, and it worked well. He, in his crew report afterwards, said he totally forgot that it was even there. And again, it was one where the recommendation was tell them to take something so they can get some good sleep. That fell through the cracks, and it never got told to them. In regard to the urinary tract infection for Fred, the other difficulty that occurred was, we didn't know, number one, we didn't know what his temperature was. He was having chills, which means he was having a fever. But that was all we knew. You had a really, really cold environment. So was the chills coming from that or from his urinary tract infection, which we know post hoc that he did have? And in retrospect, the organism which he was infected with, they didn't have any antibiotics that would have treated it, even if we knew what it was, or we knew if we were going to shotgun and just say, take whatever is there, nothing would have worked against the particular bug that he had. And that was all due to, again, some miscommunication or misinterpretation probably from the crew regarding how long were they supposed to be wearing their urinary collection devices. And if you wear that for days, which they did because they thought they were not supposed to dump urine, so they were hanging on to it, and you get a backflow pressure, and all of a sudden now you got bacteria in the bladder and what. So, everybody that's talked about communications, and you certainly have emphasized that, Jerry, man, that's the big thing. Whether you're talking
Yes,
engineering systems or medical systems, it's all very important.
well, after all, the human body is just another system. Has to be.
That's right. You got it.
That's right. I got a question from the audience, and I think Fred Hayes ought to take a crack at it. What would you consider to be one of the most important recommendations or pieces of advice for astronauts preparing for the Artemis missions?
What was the most important? What was it, Jerry? Important?
Recommendation, piece of advice, whatever you would pass along to the folks that are going to come behind you and go to the moon.
Well, I think what we showed more graphically than other missions, although the same thing applied in other missions that had problems, was the degree of integrated simulations we did. That working, and most of them all along the way, working with problems that could be put in from the simulators themselves. I think there were about 500 failures that could be imparted in the command module simulator, and that was thoroughly tested for the mission control team and ourselves in these integrated simulations by a group of a separate group that set up the scenarios to test us, if you will, and I think took great glee if they made us, the crew or the mission control, look bad. And in fact, they worked hard at that to test us, to have us finally tuned to handle problems. And I think that's essential. It's real easy to be convinced when you get the hardware that's been through all the testing and qualifications, and to think you're going to be okay, but you never know when that unexpected thing's going to happen, and it did on almost every mission. In fact, As those in the room here know, we almost aborted 2 other landings on the 14 and 16. So it's you cannot avoid having the right training systems available to be able to test both the team ready to handle anything that may happen on their mission.
Okay, another question, this one from Bill Shepard that's along that line. Bill says that during the shuttle period, there must have been a period where the MOD people said that it probably, mission ops people, that it was not good to do irrational simulations, that where you knew that, I'm assuming what Bill means here is where you knew that it was kind of far-fetched, and that it, and I can tell you, being a flight director on gazillion simulations, of course we used to get upset that because they'd give us a failure and we'd fix it. They'd give us another failure, we'd fix it. Then they'd give us 2 at once and we'd start scrambling a little bit, and then they'd give us 3. We knew they could drive us to our knees, but that's what we wanted. Were we happy with it? Not while it was happening, but when it was all over and when we got back, when we really got to flying, the fact that we were being tested well beyond anything, I think, is what actually got us through Apollo 13. It's nothing like we had ever seen. And so I think there is a good lesson there. And I think my answer to Bill, and I don't know if any of you involved have a different take on this, but I think absolutely the sim supervisor people that are running these high fidelity SIMs where you got crew and control center working together, drive them to their knees. That's my point. Fred, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. No, I think the other thing that I might mention that I hope they have the capability, certainly for the first missions in Artemis, is the manual capability of the crew to step in when things, if appropriate, when things aren't going well. I thought of the mission that I think was the Boeing vehicle that was unmanned that was going to rendezvous with space station. And I thought if they had a crew on board, even though the thing had shut down early, if they had engine stop capability and had a FIDO capability that could have fed them through it with a burn card to do a P-30, they probably could have salvaged that rendezvous. That obviously they couldn't since they depended totally on the automation facet and software. And of course, we didn't even have a computer for quite a while. So having manual control was also critical of doing the several of the maneuvers, mid-course maneuvers we did on the way home.
You know, Ed, you're making a good point there. I went back and looked at Apollo 9 because we had to make that. Bill Stovall talked about the PC+2 burn that sped us up and got us home earlier and got us into a good landing spot. Was a big, long burn by the descent propulsion system in this stack configuration. And I've had people occasionally ask me questions that, well, was that the first time you'd ever done that? And the answer is no. Actually, on Apollo 9, and this is a testing point that I think fits to Artemis and subsequent missions. We did a burn with a descent propulsion system docked that was longer than we used on PC+2. And I wanted to read, it picks up on what you just said, Fred. This was the first crewed throttling of an engine in space and increased the spacecraft's orbit to 130 by 300 miles. And so then after that, and that burn was long. That burn was longer than the the PC plus 2 burn. So we had actually done that, and I went back into the mission objective to see why did we do that. And the only thing I could get out of it, and maybe you guys know something different, they just wanted to do it to make sure it could be done if they ever needed it. And they also, it followed the throttling profile for the landing. In other words, they were moving throttle up and down, and so I think there's a message there for Artemis that make sure you test everything you can, probably in Earth orbit if you can do it, before you commit yourself to go to the moon, to see what kind of capability you do have in funny configurations. And so any thoughts on that, Jack Lausma, or anybody? Bill Moon, whoever.
I have a thought.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I could have a back up a little bit and give the flight control teams, the 4 teams, some real kudos for getting our guys back. We didn't talk about the fact that one thing that was a problem was the consumables to get home with. And so we have a vehicle here that's supposed to be used for 3 guys for 2 days or something like that, 2 guys for 3 days. And then now this vehicle's got to be used for 3 guys for 4 days. So we have this consumable problem that we need to solve. Electrical power, oxygen, water for cooling the electronics. You solve the CO2 problem, but what you decided to do was to put the backup crew into the simulator, set it up exactly the way it was with Fred and his buddies, and then decide how fast you meter out these 3 consumables and what you do with them to make sure that when you get to the end, you got enough of them. And one thing that caused, of course, was that they get very cold inside of the lunar module because you didn't have enough electrical power to keep it warm and get back home. So it was what, 35, 38 degrees in the lunar module for a long period of time. And people would come up to me and they would say, we got to do something to get them warmer. And I said, if we do try to do that, they'll never get back. And what your people did was they got in the back room and they decided, based on what those simulations showed, how rapidly you could meter out electrical power, oxygen, and propellants. And so that was a major find in getting these guys back safely. And that's all a tribute to the flight control teams.
Well, I happen to agree with that, but I think the crew played a major role too. And I agree with everything you say. It does take that combination. You almost, I know in the Apollo missions that I was heavily involved in, like landing phase, I felt like I was in the cockpit with those guys. And I know they knew we had their back. So it was this teamwork concept that really fit. Now, of course, we didn't have nearly as much automated as Artemis is going to have. But I think when you have options to throw switches and throttles and so forth, handle throttles and so forth, it's really, really important. And that teamwork was beautiful. Joe, you had a point?
I did. Ancillary to everything that I agree with about doing simulations and having the mission control team do the drawings and know the systems better than anybody else on the planet, okay? Somebody had to remember that there was a sneak circuit wiring by which you could recharge the entry batteries in the command module from the LEM. Somebody had to remember that and take action on it. And it was a beautiful thing. So I think that for Artemis, there ought to be this kind of analysis, not just of reliability, but of support for failures in one vehicle by another vehicle, in one part of the system by another part of the system. A rescue to Earth or a rescue to the surface of the moon should be part of the development and review process, that in-flight maintainability versus simply reliability and redundancy, which was thought of early in Apollo, probably ought to be thought of again, especially for lunar surface. And the only final thing I have is that when the Artemis crew finally gets to the moon, and they've done the basic safety stuff and configuration stuff, that they get on their suits and go outside and start building the Alan B. Shepard Memorial Golf Course.
Richard Jennings, how are we doing on time? Can somebody give us some guidance? Are we okay on time?
I think you're doing fine. If you need to go on a little bit, that's fine. We've reached the end. It was 11:15, but if we need to go on a little bit, go ahead.
Well,
Gary?
I would just,
Jerry,
yeah.
I've got one comment. As the only person in this entire panel that did not have firsthand experience, but only spectator experience of Apollo 13, but I've had a lot of human factors experience. And getting to what Bill Shepard had to say in regarding SIMS, I think the thing that Apollo 13 proved is that the SIMS will teach the crew, the Capcoms, the flight control team to be able to work as a team, and that whether you test for some particular malfunction, like you never tested for what happened on Apollo 13, doesn't really matter as much as being able to work as a team and think outside the box. Well, just because it's never happened doesn't mean we can't fix it. And Apollo 13 proved that. So you don't worry about testing about the team, whatever you can think of ahead of time, working together. And if, God forbid, something bad does happen, then you know you can work any kind of problem, and you do it as a group, and you think outside the box, and it works just like it did in Apollo 13. So I think that's the biggest lesson from Apollo 13, is to be able to do what the crew and Capcoms and everybody with Apollo 13, even though they didn't prepare for what happened.
Hey, there was a minor
I
bit of
think you're right. And Bill Reeves, go ahead.
Yeah, along that same line, the biggest warning I can give for future programs is complacency. There's a tendency nowadays in all vehicle designs and support to turn everything over to the computers. And one of the big differences back in those days was we didn't have all that computer power, and it forced you to have your head in the system at all times. You were monitoring data, you knew what the system was doing at any given time, and that enabled you to be able to react to off-nominal problems. And we've seen this in industry and in the space program, where we're turning more and more capability over to the computers and taking the man out of the loop. And I think that's a dangerous thing to do.
Well, picking up on that too, and Joe Kerwin alluded to it, the flight controllers in mission control actually drew our own drawings of the electrical system, the plumbing systems, and all that. Now, we worked it with the contractor team, that whether it was Rockwell or Grumman, whoever, and they would sign off and say, yeah, you got that right. Those schematics that we drew ourselves, and I say we because everybody in the control center had a system involved, drew themselves. You knew that thing like the back of your hand. I did that in Gemini when I was a GNC, and I knew that propulsion system and reaction control system like it was like I could think of it in my sleep. And I don't know whether we're going to have that kind of capability on the ground. Maybe the computers on the ground can take that place, but that actual hands-on drawing of that, I think, as Joe hinted at, was monumental. I know the guys like Bill Moon, Bill Reeves, they knew their systems in and out. Okay, I don't see any more questions coming up on the Q&A screen. And anybody got a very important thought they want to leave today with? I think there's a lot to learn from every mission we flew in Apollo about going on and going back on Artemis, but 13 certainly was full of them. there was a lot of opportunity to learn, and hopefully it'll help the Artemis people get back. Anything else? Anybody want to make a point?
One of the things that we didn't talk about too much was the fact that we had never in our simulations thought that we might have a situation where we had to get back with the lunar module. I think there were some procedures in there somewhere about a lunar lifeboat or a LEM lifeboat or something like that. But I don't think we ever had a simulation that was so intense that we got so many failures at one time that we thought we were ever going to have to use the lunar module to get back home with. So all the thinking that went into that was added together, I guess you may say, when the real thing happened. And we had all the knowledge, like you say, we knew those schematics like the back of our hand. And we used that knowledge to solve a problem we'd never solved before.
Yeah, and you know, it's funny, we didn't simulate the lunar module as a lifeboat. We talked about that it could be a lifeboat. And that was about the extent of it, and said, yeah, you could do this and you could do that, but we never simmed it. I think we're probably up against our time stop. I'll turn it back to you, Richard, I guess, and let you wrap it up.
Well, thank you so much, Jerry. It was just as good as I'd hoped. This was a great panel. Hopefully some lessons learned for Artemis or even other exploration going forward. And look forward to seeing everybody at ISMS in next year.
Happy birthday, 50th anniversary, belated to Apollo 13. Thank you, Richard.